Good evening. Welcome to the Green Party of New York State of the State. I'm Peter LaVenia, the state party's co-chair. Tonight I'm joined by Gloria Mattera, also the co-chair of the state party, and Howie Hawkins, our two-time gubernatorial candidate. This afternoon, Governor Cuomo presented his vision for New York State. We're here to offer you the Green Party's vision for a different New York, one for all New Yorkers and not just a wealthy ruling class who have benefited from 8 years of Governor Cuomo and a dysfunctional legislature in Albany. This year we'll be running candidates for governor and other statewide offices, and our candidates will put forward a platform based around our vision for New York. To begin, I'd like to introduce Gloria Mattera, the state party co-chair and our 2010 candidate for lieutenant governor. Gloria will speak on the pressing issues of single-payer health care and also the need for campaign finance reform to deal with the corrosive effects of money on our political system.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Gloria Mattera, co-chair of the Green Party of New York State, and I'm also a healthcare professional who has been working in the public hospitals in New York City for over 25 years. So I've seen really firsthand the damage done to our most vulnerable New Yorkers in this dysfunctional, profit-driven healthcare system. And that's why I'm excited to talk to you today about one of the Green Party's top 4 legislative issues. The Green Party believes that access to quality, affordable health care is a human right. It's not a commodity that benefits insurance and pharmaceutical companies. We advocate for a system that covers everyone, regardless of their employment, their gender, their status, their income. And this system is a comprehensive and an equitable system. And New York has the opportunity to lead the way in offering universal, publicly funded health care that will eliminate financial barriers for everyone while maintaining the choice of doctors and hospitals that you would like to go to. And this is why the Green Party of New York has partnered with the Campaign for New York Health to bring a single-payer, universal health care program to New York State through the New York Health Act. Just briefly, the New York Health Act is been passed in the Assembly. It is currently has short one vote in the Senate, the Republican-dominated Senate, to go to Governor Cuomo's desk. It's paid for through progressive payroll taxes and taxes on capital gains, which means 98% of New Yorkers, of us, will be paying a lot less for health care and getting better quality health care. It'll also cut costs in health care for our state and local government employees by 75% or more. And that really helps reduce the burdens on local governments. And so Governor Cuomo didn't mention anything about healthcare today in his State of the State. He did say a few months ago that he thought that this bill, the New York Health Bill, had some merit and would take a look at it, possibly sign it if it came to his desk. But he certainly hasn't put any effort into that. And so what we continue to do, as we did in 2017, is the Green Party of New York will be joining with other partners. We will be lobbying, doing call-in days. We are out in the street giving information to people. We're knocking on doors, doing simple healthcare surveys to get a sense of how people are dealing with the healthcare burdens that they have now. And so we will continue to do this in 2018. And in addition, our candidates running for office in 2018 will make this one of our signature platform issues. I'd like to take just my remaining time to talk briefly about something that also did not come up in a very strong way today from Governor Cuomo, and that is really about electoral reform and campaign finance reform. The governor may have mentioned a few improvements, early voting, more transparency, voting transparency, whatever that might really mean, but without a significant reform, both in electoral laws and campaign financing, then we will continue to have a dysfunctional and undemocratic system. And people who are voting, the voters, the voters, will be forced into the position of voting for the lesser of two evils, or putting in office somebody who is corrupt, inefficient, and not really caring about what the voters have to say, only caring about the lobbyists and the rich who donated to their campaigns. So the Green Party is serious about voter integrity. Votes are not for sale. And so what we need to do is sweeping reform, instant runoff voting, proportional representation, and full public funding. Candidates will not be allowed to spend or raise private money, but be given the amount of money needed to get their message out to the voters. And that means all candidates. We need to break the stranglehold of the two-party corporate domination in both state and local elections. And so this will definitely be able to have people give their voice, elect who they want to elect to, and not who they're afraid to get into office. And so the Green Party will be continuing to fight for electoral reform, for full public financing. And I hope that you will go to our website, gpny.org, look up all our healthcare materials so that you can inform people and be informed about the New York Health Act, and so that you can sign up and hear about the other issues that we're working on, and hopefully will join us. And I'd like to send it back to Peter. Good night.
Thank you, Gloria. The core of our party's mission is defending the environment against the attacks made against it by capitalism, and to help to create a livable planet for all. Three issues stand out in this legislative session: the looming climate crisis and the need to transition to a 100% renewable economy, the mass transit crisis in New York City and across the state, and the need to ban single-use plastic bags. I'd like to talk about this in turn because Governor Cuomo really didn't discuss this at all during his State of the State today. The climate crisis is here, and we need drastic action taken immediately in order to halt the worst effects. One of the things that we are feeling here in New York State is the deep freeze that has been going on for the last 2 weeks. And this is linked to the catastrophic climate change that is happening in the Arctic. And so what we are looking at is really trying to build a green program in New York State that deals with this. One of the first things that we've talked about is divesting from fossil fuel infrastructure in the New York State Pension Fund. Now, we do applaud Governor Cuomo for talking about this in his State of the State. It's one of the few things he mentioned about in terms of the climate. But of course, that is the comptroller's job. And although Governor Cuomo can put pressure on the comptroller, we really need an all-out effort from the governor, legislature, and the citizenry to get the comptroller to divest from fossil fuel investments in the public pension fund. One of the things that we can do, and we should ask the governor to do, is to halt construction here in the Capitol District of gas turbines that he'd like to power the Capitol and the Empire State Plaza, where the State of the State address took place. This is part of what the Green Party has been talking about for a number of years. We need to halt investment in that infrastructure, that fossil fuel infrastructure that would, unfortunately, if built, be used for decades to come. We need to invest in renewable infrastructure and 100% renewable energy. So besides divesting from the pension fund, we're calling for a goal of 100% renewable energy by 2030. Now, there is a bill in the legislature to do this. Governor Cuomo, again, did not talk about it. It's something that Greens have been pushing for quite some time now. Within his State of the State, Governor Cuomo did talk about 400 megawatts of offshore wind that he'd like to see built in the next 2 years, capping out at 800 megawatts by the end of next year. Now, this is great to call for, but it isn't good enough to avoid catastrophic climate change. In fact, the reports of transition to 100% renewable energy for New York State would require us to have about 59,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2030 if we're going to actually transition to a 100% renewable economy. So we need to see massive investment in offshore wind, especially in Long Island, where scientists have called it the Saudi Arabia of wind power, actually. And it wouldn't only just help us transition to a 100% renewable future and avoid the effects of catastrophic climate change, but as part of a Green New Deal with good living wage public jobs, we could see the creation of at least 4.5 million jobs around the state if we invested in renewable energy. And in Long Island alone, if we started to install that offshore wind, we could see nearly 60,000 jobs created and $13 billion in local economic output. which is an incredible number and shows the power of the green energy economy. Something, again, that unfortunately Governor Cuomo did not discuss in his State of the State today. Now, California is going to hit about 50% renewable energy generated by 2020. Governor Cuomo has talked about trying to do this by sometime in the 2030s. That's far too late and far too little. We need a comprehensive climate action plan with actual benchmarks and goals that simply has not been put forward by the legislature or by Governor Cuomo. We need a bold new target for all new vehicles sold in New York State to be zero emissions within the next 5 to 10 years. Norway has set their goal by 2025. India has done so by 2030, and a number of other countries have done so. It's time for New York State to take that step and to move to banning the sale of all but zero emissions vehicles within the next 5 to 10 years. In fact, a Merrill Lynch study showed that by 2024, these vehicles will be cheaper than gas-fired vehicles. And it would help us if we converted buildings in the state to zero carbon emissions, all new buildings. We need a 40% reduction of carbon emissions. To do that, we need to transition to zero energy buildings at the rate of 126,000 houses a year. That's something we call for. We also need a public power utility in New York State in order to help us transition. This is something that Howie Hawkins has talked about in his races, that other Greens have talked about. It's a way to democratize the energy sector and to make sure that what revenues are raised by renewable energy go back into the renewable sector and to the public coffers. One of the things that Governor Cuomo has been talking about over the last few months, and was, again, unfortunately not raised in his State of the State, but does deal with climate change, is a congestion charge in New York City to reduce the amount of automobile traffic going into Manhattan. We think that this is a positive step. We wish he had mentioned it again in his State of the State. But it is something that, if implemented, would reduce the amount of car traffic and could potentially fund expansion of mass transit in New York City, which is another major agenda point that unfortunately Governor Cuomo did not address in the State of the State. But as we have seen over the last year, the mass transit system in New York City, which is the economic engine of the city, is breaking down. Fewer than 65% of all trains reach their destination on time. This is the lowest for any major city in the industrialized world. At the same time, a number of reports have shown that the governor and the legislature over the last 30 years have stripped the MTA of $1.5 billion worth of funding, and under Governor Cuomo's administration have taken money that should be put into mass transit and sent it to other places, like bailing out ski resorts last winter, and into other pet projects that Governor Cuomo wanted to see developed instead of mass transit. This is wrong. We need to invest in this mass transit infrastructure. We need to invest heavily both for the economy of New York City, the economy of New York, and to help prevent catastrophic climate change. The initial estimates show that we may need somewhere between $30 and $50 billion worth of investment in the MTA. Again, this should be done with public living wage jobs, part of a Green New Deal to green the economy. It's quite possible that we may see a massive return on this investment. There was a report today in the New York Times that it may take $111 billion actually to do this, but that the returns from this are so great in a city that generates over $1 trillion worth of economic investment that the $111 billion is really a drop in the bucket in terms of the multiplier effect that it would create. And this is something else that we talk about in our green vision for New York State. We should look into a state bank that could help us invest these both the revenues and the profits generated from mass transit and put it back into infrastructure projects around the state, into worker co-ops, into providing low-interest loans to these kind of infrastructure projects in the future. So these are two major things that we want to focus on, both in terms of climate change and also in terms of the economic engine of New York State. And besides New York City, we need to focus on long-term mass transit expansion upstate as well. This is something that we've talked about both, in the major cities and in the suburban and rural areas. We need to interlink and move from an automobile economy to an economy of zero emissions vehicles, mass transit, to dense housing, move away from a fossil fuel centered economy to a renewable economy. And finally, the plastic bag ban. This is something that is an important step towards a greener future. We've all seen and we all know the single-use plastic bags that blow around in the wind, that clog our landfills, that are a waste of energy and resources. New York City attempted to take a step towards this last year and was stopped by Governor Cuomo in the legislature. So the Green Party is calling for a ban on plastic bags in order to move towards that renewable future. Governor Cuomo has talked about this in the past as something that he might support. Unfortunately, again, he didn't discuss it in his State of the State, but we do believe that we need to move forward to this. And at this point, I'd like to introduce Howie Hawkins, who was our party's gubernatorial candidate in 2010 and 2014. Howie will discuss how to build a progressive finance system that works for all New Yorkers and a high-quality public education system for all.
Good evening. So Peter says, basically, how do we pay for this? A public bank, a public energy system, an energy transition. Gloria mentioned healthcare for all through a public healthcare plan. And the state faces, according to newspaper reports, a budget deficit of $4 to $8.6 billion. Cuomo didn't say much in his State of the State address about this. He does have a budget message coming up, but he has a record on what he would do in the face of budgets. When he took office in 2011, the state faced a $10 billion deficit. And of course, he drastically cut spending, taxes, and state workers, an austerity budget. And at a news conference soon after taking office, he said, quote, "I'm a progressive who's broke," end quote. But of course, he was broke because he refused to tax the rich. And in our state of New York, which has the most unequal income inequality of any state in the nation that has the fourth most income inequality and the first most wealth inequality of any nation in the world, in New York, the top 1% on average gets 45 times more income than the average of the bottom 99% of us. There's money that the rich have that if they paid taxes like they used to, there wouldn't be a budget deficit. And we'd be trying to figure out how to spend the income. Now, progressive taxation and public provision can only ameliorate the inequalities that are generated systematically by our capitalist economy. So let me say a word about system change that Peter touched on. The wages that we have earned since 1973 have been stagnant. From 1945 to 1973, they kept pace with productivity. But since 1973, productivity's doubled and our wages have been stagnant. So all the gains are going to profits, not wages. And basically, corporate America broke the great compromise that came out of the Great Depression and World War II, that we would share the gains in productivity, how we produce more for each hour we work. And what's been made worse, and that's, the normal operation of capitalism. You go to work, you get a wage, the boss gets the surplus or the profit that you create every day, and he gets it from all the workers. So the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And that's what we've seen. And it's been made worse by the increasing monopolization and financialization of the economy. So they're not only getting profits, they're getting unearned income from monopoly profiteering and predatory finance, which are just cannibalizing the middle and working classes. So we're talking about system change for a democratic and ecological socialism that would have four features. Markets would be free of monopoly profiteering and predatory finance. Essential goods like healthcare and energy, broadband, and banking would be public utilities that operate at profit for public benefit instead of for maximizing private profit. They operate at cost for public benefit instead of maximizing profit for private owners. And public enterprises in these areas that I mentioned, healthcare, banking, broadband, and energy will lower the cost of living and doing business. And they will essentially provide the public avenues of private commerce. So the third thing is in the private sector, we want to promote worker co-ops, where the workers get the full fruits of their labor instead of giving away half of what they make to the owners of the regime. And that will no longer generate inequality at the point of production. And fourth, we need public planning so we have a plan for sustainable production where everybody get what they need instead of under capitalism where it's grow or die if you're a firm and we're just growing and consuming the environment. So that's our vision. But for now, we want to talk about just this year. How do we pay for the things that the state is already providing to ameliorate the inequality generated by the private economy? So we're talking about progressive tax reform. And Cuomo really didn't say much in his State of the State address. But I'm going to give you some places where we could generate more income than we are now by taxing the rich again. Remember, I said we're facing a $4 to $8.6 billion deficit. If we went back to the personal income structure we had in the 1970s, where the top bracket was double what it is now, and actually the bottom bracket is half of what it is now. So what they've done since then is raise taxes on the poor and cut taxes on the rich. If we went back to what we had then, we'd have at least $8 billion more in revenue. And working class and middle class people would get some tax cuts. So right there, you've covered the deficit. Here's a way to double cover the maximum deficit estimated, and that's the stock transfer tax. Since 1980, that tax has been collected since 1906. Since 1980, instead of keeping it for the public funding for the revenues of the state, it's been rebated right back to the stock traders. It's a tiny transaction. It's a tiny tax on each transaction, pennies per stock, but it generates a lot because of all the trading going on in the New York Stock Exchange. That's $15 billion right there. We have $8 billion a year in corporate welfare, far more than any other state, proportionally and in absolute terms. And it's not effective. So there's money to be saved. And then people think, oh, you're going to provide everybody with health care through this New York health plan. Actually, it will save the state money. I haven't done the numbers for the state, but I have done it for the city of Syracuse, the county of Onondaga, and I've looked at some other municipal governments. And basically, the difference between what we would pay in a progressive payroll tax to fund a single-payer healthcare plan for all, and what these government entities now pay in private insurance premiums, they save 75% or more in their expenses. I don't know what the numbers are for the state, but it's certainly in the billions. And if we can save 75% of what we're now saving, that's more savings. And then finally, on progressive tax reform, we've got to save our cities and towns and counties, particularly upstate, who are facing bankruptcy. Niagara Falls, Fulton, Albany, Syracuse, on the brink of insolvency. And that's because the governor has flattened revenue sharing, which has been cut drastically since the 1970s. In the 1970s, it was 8% of state revenues. Now it's less than 0.5%. If we just increased it back to 1%, that would double the revenues that local governments get. And if we did that, they could not only fully fund their services and get out of their financial crisis, they could lower our highest in the nation property taxes. So these are the kinds of things we want to put into a progressive tax reform proposal. And the basic point is there's plenty of money in New York's economy to cover the budget and much more if the rich pay their fair share. And this state has $1.5 trillion gross domestic product. If it was ranked among the nations in the world, it'd be the 11th biggest GDP in the world, ahead of countries like Russia and Australia and South Korea. So the money's there if the rich pay their fair share. And the other issue I want to address briefly is the problems with our schools. This was a hot button issue when I ran for governor in 2015, the high stakes testing and the underfunding of our high poverty districts. On funding, the state is $4.3 billion short of what it promised when it enacted the foundation aid formula, which was the remedy for the decision in the campaign for fiscal equity. And instead, the state cut that funding and is now resisting lawsuits to get it back. One by the New York Students for Educational Rights, who are representing students and parents in New York City and Syracuse, and the other by the 8 Small Cities lawsuit. And instead, the state is arguing they give enough. But The evidence in court, and the Court of Appeals rule on this, is that we're not. And that's why these high poverty districts don't have basic things they need. The other big problem is high stakes testing, which not only degrades education, it sets up a test, punish, and privatize agenda where high poverty districts, students, teachers, and schools are defined, because we know what the outcome's going to be, as failing because they do poor on a test. And that's used to justify privatization in the charter schools. These are money-making gimmicks that are not improving education. I'm talking about the high stakes testing in the charter schools. So the state should stop underfunding high poverty districts and resisting those lawsuits. It should end the test, punish, and privatize agenda. And it has to deal with the segregation in our state. We have among the highest levels of public school segregation in our metropolitan regions in the country. It's not down south, it's in New York State. And we know that desegregation by race and class is really the key variable there, is the only proven way to increase and close the achievement gap on standardized tests. But beyond that, it improves other educational outcomes for all students, poor, working class, and middle class alike, including intellectual self-confidence, leadership skills, critical thinking, creativity, problem solving, teamwork, the things that are really important when you get out in life and in the economy. So it's time to drop these costly gimmicks of so-called accountability testing in charter schools and do what we know works: fully funded, integrated public schools. So my basic point in all of this is that New York services, like public education, could be fully funded if we tax the rich again. Thank you.
Thank you, Howie. Andrew Cuomo would have us believe the reforms he promised this afternoon will lead to a better New York. Yet at best, they're piecemeal reforms on important issues like climate change, on campaign finance ethics, and at worst, they are corporate giveaways, like his proposal in his State of the State to build a new arena on Long Island at the cost of $1 billion to lure the New York Islanders back. Or they're a race to the bottom for communities that desperately need comprehensive and sustained public investment, like his proposal to make municipalities around the state compete for funds to rebuild their economies. As Greens, we believe in true system change, not bandages on problems that are at the heart of our unequal and undemocratic society. Our vision for the future, what we call eco-socialism, is a true economic and political democracy where working New Yorkers have a say in building a better tomorrow. I'd like to invite you to help us build that future. Go to our website, gpny.org, that's gpny.org, and sign up to volunteer, get on our email list, and donate. Help us build the party that you would like to see. Become a dues-paying, sustaining member, or volunteer. Get involved with your local Green Party Chapter 2. Unlike the Democrats and Republicans, we're a grassroots party that depends on its membership to grow and thrive. And I'd like to thank you for joining us tonight.